So I'm very lucky today to have James with me. He's the Welsh Government Disabled People's Employment Champion. That's a long title. Tell me a little bit about your role.
Yeah, it's a very long title, and I think it's quite a grandiose one as well. I've always suspected on some level that I was a champion, but it's nice to have it confirmed in my job title. But yeah, so in terms of the kind of background, Wales as a country, according to the most recent statistics, which were published in 2020, has got about a 25% disability employment gap. So, you know, we've kind of recognized as a country and as a government that as a disabled person, you're disproportionately less likely to be in employment than your non-disabled peers. And so the Welsh Government is committed to a number of different programs and strategies to try and redress that balance. One of which, as much as I would like to claim to be the only champion, is to recruit a network of 5 disabled people's employment champions covering the whole country. And essentially, our role is to engage directly with as many employers as possible to try and promote all aspects of disability employment directly to them. So, for example, that can be looking at different recruitment practices that employers have, making sure that job adverts are written in a way that doesn't unintentionally exclude anyone with different impairments from applying or even being aware that that's a job role that's available. It's also looking at issues of retention. So there's quite an interesting statistic that 83% of disabled people in the UK anyway actually acquire their impairment during the course of their life. So it's only 17% of us, which includes me, I guess, who are born with an impairment. So we are quote unquote disabled from birth, if you like. In the vast majority of cases, the other 83%, people acquire their impairment, and overwhelmingly that happens during the course of people's working lives. So we're looking at, as well as recruitment, it's how we can make sure that employers are equipped to deal with situations where they have a member of staff who, whatever the impairment may be, acquires a condition during the course of their working life. And it's making sure that they're aware of how they can retain that member of staff and keep that expertise, because we'll touch on this later on, but there's all manner of different avenues of support that are available to employers and businesses to kind of address that. So yeah, we talk to the employers, as well as making obviously the ethical case for trying to include more disabled people in the workforce, which I think sort of speaks for itself. We're also really interested in kind of promoting, and again, we'll touch on this later on, but on promoting, the business case, and as well as, hiring disabled people or keeping disabled staff members on, because we believe that it's the right thing to do morally. It's also really kind of making clear to employers what some of the potential financial benefits are to them as a business. So yeah, we will talk to the employers, and then alongside us, I don't know if you're aware of Business, well, you are aware of Business Wales because you're working on the enterprise hubs, but yeah, we have alongside kind of our service, the tier 2, the second tier of the offer, if you like, is we've got 2 specialist disability employment advisors who are hired by Business Wales, and they can provide the sort of, the more in-depth specialist nuts and bolts support for rewriting HR policies, making them aware of all the different kind of schemes of government support that are available to them, and essentially whatever avenue of support that we, the champions, address and raise with the employer in conversation with them, Business Wales can then pick up and provide sort of tailored one-to-one support to identify whatever it is that, to rectify whatever it is that we sort of collectively identify. So yeah.
Brilliant. You mentioned the recruitment process there. Do you believe that the figures might not be accurate because some individuals might be scared to put on a form that they're disabled because of the stigma possibly around it?
I mean, I couldn't necessarily comment on, you know, the accuracy of like specific statistics, but I do think there's a degree of stigma, especially around the word disability or disabled. I think, you know, there's a number of different reasons why people might not necessarily disclose the fact that they are a disabled person when they're, you know, applying for jobs or taking part in different schemes or projects. Yeah, everything ranging from, you know, stigma. A lot of people who legally would be classed as disabled under the Equality Act don't necessarily use that word to describe themselves. So when they see it in a questionnaire or in an equal opportunities monitoring form, they can, you know, not tick that box because they don't feel that that word necessarily accurately reflects them. So one thing that I'm kind of personally quite keen on, and is something that when I am talking to employers, I sort of try and you know, encourage them to consider, is rephrasing that question when it's asked of prospective employees, to instead of just, you know, having a fairly blanket question, do you identify as a disabled person, it's specifically quoting the definition of disability under the Equality Act, so that, you know, anyone with a condition that doesn't necessarily fall within the traditional image of what a disabled person is. So, you know, if someone's not, the traditional image is, you know, wheelchair users or people who are visually impaired, so they have the kind of physical signs of, you know, their impairment. Anyone who doesn't fit inside that sort of traditional bracket, so thinking about people with dyslexia, for example, people with long-term mental health problems, it's kind of making sure that those people are aware that by ticking that box, they're hopefully ensuring that they're going to be able to get whatever support it is that they need to kind of, you know, help them in that role.
Absolutely. So what's your definition of disability?
So I think it's that's a huge question, and there's quite a lot that I could say on it, so I'll try and rein myself in. I think the first point that I would get across is, you know, appealing to the dictionary, if you like. If you look at the Equality Act definition of what disability is, it's any impairment, so whether that's physical or mental or sensory or cognitive, any impairment that causes difficulties in everyday life, presents additional barriers to people in everyday life over a long-term period. So, for example, if you break your arm and it takes, you know, you're in a cast for 6 weeks, that wouldn't be classed as a disability. If you have a congenital impairment, or if you know, have a spinal cord injury, or you're visually impaired, or you have an autistic spectrum condition, all of those things fit into the legal definition. So it's a very broad church and a very kind of wide category of people. Disability itself is quite a nebulous concept, I think, in that my experience as, and I said at the beginning of the call, Teams and Zoom is quite strange for me because ordinarily in everyday life, I'm someone who very obviously and very visibly has a physical impairment. And obviously with Zoom, I'm sort of just the upper half of my body. So it's not immediately apparent to people that I have a physical impairment. But you know, disability is such a broad category of people that my experience as someone who was born with a neuromuscular, you know, physical condition is obviously very different to someone who has an autistic spectrum condition or someone who's visually impaired. So yeah, it's a really wide category of people. And I think that can sometimes be why people might feel, uncomfortable or potentially a bit awkward about discussing disability, because it can feel like a bit of a minefield, because it's not one clear characteristic that you're having to sort of consider. It's a whole kind of range of different people with very different experiences from one another.
It's a very, very difficult question. I'm really, really sorry. This one's going to be a lot easier. So what are the benefits of employing disabled people?
There are absolutely loads. But
Another one, yeah.
I think, yeah, okay, so from looking at it from a purely sort of mercenary perspective, it has been demonstrated a number of times that disabled staff members they generally remain in a job for longer. They actually, and this might be a surprise to a lot of people, disabled people actually on average take a lot less sick leave than their non-disabled colleagues, which I think's quite interesting in itself. So yeah, those are the kind of, if you want to view it from purely sort of mercenary, how is this staff member going to perform perspective, then there's evidence to support that disabled people are great employees on that side. I think what's more interesting is that we touched on this before we started recording, but I can't remember the exact statistic off the top of my head, but it's between 22 and 25% of the population of Wales nationally, if you applied the legal definition of disability, would be classed as disabled people. Now that's a huge, huge proportion of society. And if you look at the economics of it, that's a huge proportion of economically active citizens within a society. So why, as a business, especially if you're an outward-facing business with, customers coming in every day, why would you not want to sort of bear that demographic in mind? And, the best way to do that, I personally think, is to reflect that demographic in your workforce. So, for example, I, as a disabled person, when I don't have my Welsh Government hat on, and I'm out and about and going to shops and going to cafes and going to restaurants and stuff, I am disproportionately a lot more likely, I think, to have a better experience in a shop or a hotel, whatever it is, if it's clear that that business has factored in the different, needs and barriers that disabled people might face. And I think the best, often the best way that employers do that is by actually hiring a disabled person themselves, because then they have an inbuilt sense of what those barriers are. And also, as a customer and as someone who, spends money at different businesses, it's genuinely very nice to see disabled people being employed by businesses. And I think increasingly we're seeing a rise in, I guess, what you could call almost like an ethical market. Consumers are really interested in, knowing the businesses they're engaging with are as ethical as possible, whether that's on environmental issues, whether that's on paying staff fair wage, whatever it is. And I think disability fits into that. I think customers, there is a statistic for this that I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was above 90% of customers were more likely to view a business favorably if they knew that they employed disabled people. And then also possibly cynically, I think, public relations and marketing and things like that are really important. And there's been a number of quite high profile cases where businesses have really, gone all out to demonstrate to people that they are getting disability right, both in terms of, their employees and their clients or customers. And yeah, the businesses that do that the PR and the marketing side of things that can generate is huge, and it's invariably really positive PR. So yeah, I'd say there's the simple kind of performance aspects of people staying in work for longer, people taking their sick leave. But then there's broader points about making sure that your business reflects quite a large percentage of the population, and then also looking at kind of PR and marketing and that side of things as well. So yeah, I'd say there's a pretty large number of reasons why it's beneficial to hire disabled staff. So.
And you did mention that there's a lot of support out there. Where would a business go to find the support, and is it in a way of funding? Is it advice, adaptations?
So there's a number of different avenues that businesses can pursue. Possibly slightly shameless bit of self-promotion, but me and my 4 colleagues within the champions role, we are all disabled people ourselves. We've got lived experience of all of this stuff. We've all, prior to working for the government, had different careers in different sectors. I don't like to blow our own trumpet too much, but we are basically pretty well versed in this stuff by now. So I'd say by all means get in contact with us, because that's what we're here for. We've got a generic mailbox, which is dpec@gov.wales. So anyone who's kind of interested in, getting advice or finding out more about what support there is available, get in contact with us. As I said, we've got 2 specialist disability employment advisors within Business Wales as well, who can, support in that service. But as a kind of headline piece of support that exists out there, and something which is, in my experience anyway, both prior to taking on this role and since starting, talking to employers, especially in the last couple of months, I'd say the Access to Work scheme that the Department for Work and Pensions run, not a lot of people know about it. It's often semi-jokingly referred to as DWP's best kept secret. But it's essentially a pot of money that the DWP can grant to provide reasonable adjustments for staff members, regardless of what impairment they might have. Especially for smaller businesses, the DWP will actually cover the entire cost in a lot of cases for reasonable adjustments. It's only really quite large employers that will be asked to kind of contribute, and even then DWP is still giving them quite a large proportion of the money for whatever it is. The maximum grant, I think, is around £68,000, so it can cover a huge amount. And when I kind of talk about reasonable adjustments, in a lot of cases, that can be really quite cheap things. I think the average cost is about £30 for a reasonable adjustment. So, it's not a huge amount of money anyway. And the DWP is quite often offering to foot the bill for it. That can be things like, having a ramp installed in an office. It can be getting someone a special piece of, a special office chair or whatever that bears their impairment more in mind. But it can also cover things like, for example, especially up in North East Wales, we've obviously got a number of businesses which are quite rural and which don't have good public transport links. So there's a degree of expectation that staff members will be able to drive to and from work. With the Access to Work grant, DWP will actually fund travel, even if it's taxis and things, for people who can't drive because of the impairment that they have. DWP can actually pay for taxis however many days a week to and from work if it's within a rural community. Now, obviously, I think there's about one taxi over on Anglesey, for example. Slight overstatement, but that money exists both for the more obvious adjustments that people might need, but it can cover a huge range of different things. So yeah, I'd say if you sort of take one thing away from what I'm talking about, aside from get in touch with us if you want to chat more, would be look up the Access to Work scheme, because I've used it in the past for myself in previous employment, and the adjustment that I had, because I've issues with manual dexterity and strength, I find typing to be quite challenging. So TWP paid for me to have access to a piece of voice recognition software, which I use instead of typing. So I can just sit as I am now and talk into my rather snazzy microphone, and the words will just appear on the screen. Now, for me, as an individual, that small piece of equipment, piece of software, has made an absolutely huge difference in terms of helping me to realize my full potential and get as much done as I possibly can. But for the organization that I was working for at the time, which was a third sector organization, it was fantastic for them, because suddenly the amount of work that I was able to get through honestly probably went up by about 500%. It was huge. So yeah, Access to Work, look it up. It's fantastic for staff members. And I would try and promote, when you're inducting a new staff member into your team, to make them aware of because it has to be led by the individual employee, but just to make sure that those employees are aware that support exists, because it's huge. Yeah, I would say absolutely look it up, because it's fantastic.
So there's so much support out there, and it's to be used. I will put the links below.
Fantastic.
And find
just please do get in touch. It's completely free of charge. Hopefully I've demonstrated that we're all fairly non-threatening individuals, and we just want to sort of have just an open and honest conversation. Absolutely. Whatever it is you want to bring to the table, whatever questions you might want to ask, like, no matter if you think they might be awkward or what have you, we're completely open, and anything really, any way that we can support you, more than happy to discuss. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It has definitely been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.